Everyone ready for the important, tomorrow's the big day, right? No, it's not Cinco de Mayo. It is Cinco de Mayo. It's Karl Marx's birthday. Karl Marx's birthday.
Taking a drink and celebrating this demise.
Yeah, well, he'll be celebrating too. All right, so everyone's seen this over and over again. We're in June. We have this session in June. When we come back in July, a few days after, if any.
Well, actually, I don't think we'll have time to do that much because we're going to see your slides of Morocco.
Yeah, well, we'll probably test positive. We may not be back till August, so we'll see. That's true. We got to do the slides of Morocco on pictures from Camelback.
So maybe we should reduce that to 3 chapters or 2 chapters.
Yeah, we're. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Let's deal with this. I set this out, the PowerPoint. Those of you that read this stuff get these statements. I just love them. I think this is why I'm reading this book. But if you want to react otherwise, it's worth doing. Clearly, Frankopan's got a thesis here. It's not that the West is the most violent society ever in the history of the earth. There are many of them. It's rather that, yeah, we're just another violent society. And that all this enlightenment, reason, democracy is all sweet, but that's not the core of it. The core of it was wealth that allowed democracy and civil society to grow.
So the question is it ever upward or cyclical? The violence and.
Well, it's been cyclical for a while. I mean, we benefited for a pretty good set of time. While rules seem to work, now the rules don't matter anymore, apparently. Why that is, I don't know the answer to that. There is, as far as civilizations go, there does seem to be this magic number of somewhere between 250 and 300, and that's about it. None of the 8 dynasties, if you call the current one a dynasty, call them 7 if you want, lasted beyond 700. Most were 250. In the British Empire, the 250 seems to be the Ottoman Empire. We're talking about the gunpowder empires here. The Ottoman Empire, the Safavid dynasty, the Mughal dynasty, 250, 300. There seems to be something about that time span that even if you've got a very successful civilization, it just doesn't go beyond that for reasons of.
But it all depends how you divide up the Roman Empire, whether that's one civilization or not.
Yeah, whether was Augustus the beginning of something completely new, the empire rather than the republic? I think that's a pretty standard piece of history. Yeah, the Roman Empire. You can even do it with the Mayans and the Incas and so forth and so forth. If everyone's, this is a common theme for a whole set of historians now that are been working for 20, 30, 40 years to say, can we just move gently, slowly, gradually toward world history, not Western history? I've shared this too many times here. So-called world history in Appalachian high school history in California. It is not world history. We teach Western civilization. And the people who say, look, if you're not going to teach world history, fine, but don't call it world history and then teach Western civilization. And if you teach,
so why is it, do you think that the democracies that we have and these things that evolved in the West when there are these other more sophisticated cultures, certainly in China and all that lasted, but they never went to the democratic? I mean, what was it that made that difference?
I mean, the standard argument is the middle class, that the middle class got control of Western civilization and created a society for itself. Freedom, basically freedom for capital, with the emphasis on private property. The greatest philosopher ever known to man was John Locke. Life, liberty, and private property. That's what civilization is all about. And you'll have people like our friend some of us, Piketty, who said, can we accept that private property is nothing more than a social construct? It's not real. It's not as if it's a rule of law like gravity. It's made up. It's very convenient and very useful, this concept of private property under certain circumstances. But when it gets overboard and private property is more important than anything else, then you've got a civilization in trouble. And so the argument tends to go that as long as you had democracy doing what democracy is supposed to do, that is control capitalism to the point that some of that wealth gets redistributed for the benefit of all, then it works quite. Democracy and capitalism are parallel. But when it goes the other direction, that capitalism sort of runs democracy, Supreme Court rulings that say money is the same as speech and so is protected, then you get in serious trouble.
That's
That's an argument. That's the argument. That's the standard argument. But his argument would be, you don't have democracy until you have wealth, and you don't have wealth until you can earn it, you can steal it, you can do both. And I think most would accept that he does a pretty good job of backing up his argument. So back and just to make that point, while we go to finishing off the Mongol dynasty, you say, God, what a bunch of thugs. And they were, I mean, violent, vicious, nasty, piles of skulls and so forth. But on the other side of it, you get this irony that is hard to deal with, that is for 150 years under the era of Pax Mongolica, the Silk Road civilizations thrived because they were made travel safe, didn't overtax, and punish the criminals, yada, 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 yada. I think this is standard stuff if you've been around any of these presentations one time or another. We've been over this many times, that it is the flip side. We're starting about 1220, 1240, 1250. Once the conquering is over, especially in China, I mean, travel across the Silk Road is safe. I mean, to the point that the Mongols are providing passports. You can wear this and you're free, you're safe. And if you got any trouble, tell us, because we'll go find the criminals and we'll deal with them. And we know how to deal with them, and they know we know how to deal with them. So you're fairly safe. And all this stuff moves back and forth across the Silk Roads from here to there. All those roads. And another piece of luck regarding the Mongols, and the luck that they had in it, a lot of it was luck, that they were able to conquer China. The dynasty they conquered and took over from was the Song dynasty. Well, the Song dynasty might have been the golden age of Chinese culture, the Song of the Ming. I mean, the stuff that by the time you get to the Song dynasty, which is after the Tang dynasty, the period of 1050 to 1240, somewhere around there, the usual 250 years or so forth. The amount of innovation that's coming out of China that will work its way across the Silk Road to the west is really rather stunning. To put a lie to the idea, well, they're not an innovative civilization, they just borrow bullshit. God, so much of Western technology came from China. Some of it, the hook, line, and sinker directly, some of it adapted along the way.
And you can make the argument, the Song dynasty had their Leonardo da Vinci 300 years before Leonardo da Vinci.
Before Leonardo da Vinci, yeah. I mean, and interestingly enough, we don't know the names of any that invented or found, or which is a curiosity, because the Chinese wrote their history books. And what's that all about? Is it that the concept that individuals don't matter, individuals just serve as civilization, as society? We don't know any of the names of any of these people who were the first to come up with gunpowder, or the magnetic compass, or the portion that the West tried over and over and over to copy and never could get it right. Finally did somewhere around the Industrial Revolution. Well, they copied paper making, printing, tea, and all. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that's being contributed along the Silk Road during this Mongol area that goes here and there across back and forth. But certainly the lion's share of the technology is coming from China.
Did I forget, or was there, did they mention anything about what language sort of got? It just seems to me sort of amazing that these vastly different cultures and languages, that this trade can happen smoothly. Is there a language that sort of dominated the trade route, do you think? Or
Turkish.
just
Turkish, Turkish to some degree. The Jewish population was fantastic in multi-language. They didn't speak Hebrew, but they learned language after language. It's not as if the Silk Road, the Silk Roads started in China, went all the way to the Mediterranean. They stopped along the way and transferred to somebody else. So there would have been a series of places where people knew a variety of languages. We're also terrible at it. Most of us know this. We're just pathetic at foreign languages. The average African speaks 3 or 4 languages. Now, granted, they are dialects of one another, but it's a facility that you pick up early on if you work at it.
I know we missed some of the early class. Didn't the Chinese also domesticate the horses? No.
Those are the steppe people. In fact, the Chinese were desperate to get horses, and then that's why the Han Dynasty, way back in the 200s, sent embassies out there to say, "Find horse. We need horses. We got problems with the Mongols or whoever, the Huns or whoever these people are to the north. They got good horses. We don't. So find good horses." And they found them in the Farragon Valley in what's now Uzbekistan.
But the interesting part about that is that the people of the south had these big Iranian horses. The Mongol horses were ponies. They were tiny, and compared to these giant horses that the invaders to the steppes were bringing. And they could run circles around them. And if you look at the diagrams of the strategy of the cavalry, the Mongol pony cavalry, you know, there are a lot of feints there, and they go that way, and then you come around. I mean, but it was the mobility.
Yeah.
Of
You don't have a lot of NBA players running marathons very well. The small is better in a variety of ways. I mean, somewhere along the line in your education, you picked this up, the magnetic compass, which is fundamental to navigating in the open ocean. That's an invention of Chinese. They didn't use it that way early on, but it's during the Song Dynasty that they say, you know, this thing we do magic tricks with, you can actually use that to navigate in the open sea if you wanted. And movable type, we give Gutenberg credit, and he ought to get credit because this was not passed on directly as something to be copied, but the Chinese were 400 years ahead of not just typing, but metallic movable printing. Now it's a little tougher in China, of course, because you don't have 26 letters that you interchange. You've got all these damn symbols. But paper currency. I mean, he talks about that. The paper currency was fundamental to the growth of trade during this Mongol period. Because the idea that people actually trust this stuff is really a bit of a miracle. I mean, we're probably 50 years away from this disappearing, but it is odd. Yeah, I mean, you see a bunch of people coming in from the steps and saying, "Wait a minute, you gave him paper money and he gave you a 6-pack of beer? What the hell? I get paper too." That hadn't worked yet. That would take a while yet before we have national banks and so forth and so forth. But they did create a line of paper credit because they had paper, and the paper credits by the Song Dynasty is trustworthy for merchants that don't want to carry bags of gold because it's heavier than hell anyway. Carrying a piece of paper that is backed up by the Chinese government as good for credit frees up all this money that can be turned into coins that the commoners can have. The commoners, once they get this coins, and start spending it. You get this There was some statistic that in a short period of time, the 1200s, I think it's written down somewhere, the number, the amount of between 1278 and 1279, the amount of silver coins in London alone went up 4 times. And so you got merchants out there that are not going to take paper money; they want silver coins. So all that's happening during the Pax Romana trade. How we square that with the violence preceded it's hard as hell to deal with. And on top of that, the Mongols were tolerant beyond belief, apparently, intentionally moving people around when they needed to break up tribal loyalty. See, we know from our own Mongol experience, the tribal loyalties are a problem. We want you to have a more cosmopolitan identity. You have a skill to operate. You're part of a trade network, yada, yada, yada. Now, a lot of people moved voluntarily, and they were free to move, and they did move because there were jobs here, and there was money to be made there, and religiously tolerance. I mean, the Mongols pretended to be every religion known to man, just sort of faking it. They couldn't care less. Not an issue for them. It didn't matter. It was about trade and this and that and so forth. And in Russia, of course, they had this enormously important influence. They chose who was going to be. They chose the center of power. It's still the center of power. They said, okay, you get to be the money collector. And over time, Ivan the First skooms up enough money. The Mongols themselves become corrupt and lazy, and the Mongols themselves will suffer from the Great Plague, and that'll give Russia the chance to become a so-called independent country. And John and others have been doing a great job talking about that. What ends the Mongol Empire? Well, it's not a society design, it's not a culture designed to run a civilization for a long time. But there's going to be rebellion here and there, and they too suffer every bit as much from the plague as Europe does. I mean, there's not a large population anyway. And when they start dying off, I mean, it's going to be relatively easier for those that were under the thumb of Mongols for 200 years to break free. So one of the positive and negative and positive aspects of the Mongol Pax Romana is it allows because there's freedom of movement, the plague will spread. Spreads through. How do you get the plague? How do you get the plague? Bitten by a flea. Fleas traveling on black rats. One of the things that finally ends in Port Buddhas puts the black plague to an end more or less in Europe after multiple reoccurrences for hundreds of years, is brown rats outcompete the black rats for habitat, and the brown rats don't carry the fleas in any case. So we talked about this before too. If you've never heard it before, you've seen it the first time in this book. How this death toll in Europe, if you're ones that die, it's pretty awful. If you survive, it turns out to be a real benefit to Europe, and it benefits Europe in curious ways. I mean, the geographic places that benefit are those where the most death occurs, and then where there's very little death, those places don't benefit. I mean, the numbers, no one really knows, of course. The guesses were the second bullet here points. Some guys sort of guessed it was about a third, and the suspicion is he came up with a third because he read that somewhere in the Bible. But in some villages, just everyone died. In some cases, more like 80%. It wasn't evenly spread. It wasn't evenly spread. Where it's spread the most, those places are going to benefit the most at the end of the plague on these curious reasons. The places where it doesn't spread don't benefit in a similar way. So what the numbers? See, what's the benefit of that? Well, what is the benefit of that? What is the benefit? We talked about this with the European person, and I think he did a pretty good job of summarizing this. What benefit do you get at the end of the plague if you survived? ain't many workers. There were plenty of workers. Europe was overpopulated, to be frank. And now it's underpopulated. If you got labor to offer, you can strike a much better bargain, better wages, less working, less days, maybe none that you have to work for the Lord. You might even be given some land for free. Yada yada. You got the freedom to move because the nobles down the road died off, and you can move down and find a better deal. Interest rates will fall because there's money. There's not that much buying power for a while. There's a shift in the favor of the young. The young tend to save less, spend more. That will stimulate when they're earning a little bit more money, maybe a lot more money. They save less because they're going to live forever. They think they'll accumulate stuff down the road. There is some evidence, at least especially in Britain, that this also leads to lowering in family sizes, which is a significant benefit to the kids that are being, when there's only 2 or 3 kids or 5, or instead of 20 that you're raising, there's 2 or 3 or 4 kids get nurtured, they get taken care of. They're probably going to be brighter. A whole bunch of positive things happen because
they married later.
I searched and searched and searched, but it's very clear that happens. It's very clear that happens in the Industrial Revolution. And I thought I couldn't find anything that validated that.
They didn't need the children to work.
Yeah, but they would work. They would work. But so there was still that. But this last bullet point, those that survived were healthier. They tended to live longer. They died less young. It makes sense. I mean, it's what epidemics do. In a brutal biological situation, that's what happens. And so Europe has got this interesting parts of Europe, Northern Europe, more than Southern Europe, Northwest Europe, much more than Central Europe or Russia for that matter, have got this benefit of serfdom's almost gone by the end of but in Western Europe, by the end of the Black Plague. It's not that peasants won't owe more taxes. It'll all creep back in. The nobility, by the time we get their French Revolution, have reestablished control over the countryside. But the peasants owned their land in France. It wasn't like they were certain, they were bound to the land. In Russia, hell, they were still bound to the land until 1856. And some of that is because not enough people in Russia died during the plague, which is just pure, dumb, stupid, bad luck, good luck, whatever you want to give to it, rather than, well, they aspire to democracy, and democracy sort of, well, yeah, that happened, but the causes of that happening, that's more of an effect than it is a cause. So the argument goes.
What happened in China? Were they just more resistant as it started?
No, China collapsed. China had quite a collapse too, and it had a similar benefit. So China was overpopulated. India was overpopulated. The death that occurred there was a positive thing for them. And so the overpopulation problem that China will eventually experience, whether it's still there or not, is an interesting question. Will not come to a head until about 1750. I mean, and so in a way, this was a good break for China to depopulate it to some degree. Although there's numbers later on to suggest that it's still populated. So what do we say? The economic changes. He's going to drive home. Where's Frankopan going with all? He's going to England, his home country. England's going to have this empire. And if you show up in July or do the reading, you'll see that he's going to talk a lot about England, and suggest that England, here's why we became a great empire. But we were already kind of in trouble by at the height of the Industrial Revolution. There was already trouble, and so forth and so forth. And he'll carry that on through. So he's going to focus a lot on England naturally. But point made. So finishing off that kind of chapter, why he brings us up, I don't know. Genoa, it had been part of the theme, Genoa and Venice, Genoa and Venice, Genoa and Venice. In Venice, competing with one another. Apparently, I didn't know this. Genoa gambles on trying to take the Venice's eastern ports and challenge them, and they lose. And so Venice is going to just blossom for another little period of time here with already a power of itself. Is going to have even more trade. The spices are coming across the Silk Road. They get the spices. I was fascinated to read. I'd heard this once before, so it was not new to me, but I've completely forgotten it. That one of their most money-making items of export was paints for all the Renaissance painters that are now going to be employed because there's so much trade. I mean, the reds and the blues, these colors that Europe just didn't have, and they're coming from places that are in Anatolia and so forth. They got these gorgeous blues that we're going to see in Renaissance painting down the road. So Venice is going to prosper for a little while, and then Venice, of course, will be in trouble. Which, for those that have traveled, he does mention a little city-state here that gives Venice kind of a half run for its money for a little while, called Ragusa, but we don't know what it's Ragusa. We know it as Dubrovnik, and Dubrovnik. If you visit, if you've not, don't get it on your list. It's worth a couple mornings. Asia is going to boom as well after the plague for the same sort of reasons. Those that survive get a better deal. The trade will return. It's not as if Europe is running the show by any means now. Columbus hasn't even happened. I mean, he mentions Cochin, which is going to give Calicut, the great trading port, a real run for its money by underbidding them. It'll offer cheaper port fees than Calicut. So you got lots of prosperity in Asia still for quite some time. Ming China and the Ming dynasty will overthrow the Mongols, and the Ming dynasty is enormously successful for some time. And just to point out, I mean, I will hear it said occasionally, all empires expand. Look at the Ming. Here's the Ming Empire in 1400. Here's the Ming Empire in 1640. They don't expand. They actually shrink and do just fine. And what that's all about is an interesting issue, but it's not necessarily the case that it's in the nature of empires to expand. There's several Chinese. The Sung dynasty was even more proof positive that the most successful dynasty in China didn't expand. Now that's a problem because they now have rivals on their borders. But we'll talk about this later. It's worth doing. It is interesting that the Ming leave these really nice cities like Nanjing and Hangzhou and so forth, and move their capital to this crappy place, Beijing. Why did they move to Beijing? Because that's where the Mongols had moved their capital. The Mongols had used it as their capital. It's a lousy place for a city. It's cold in the winter. The air is lousy, and there's not a lot of evidence of why of what the decision was, why they made it. But the best guess is, well, this is where our problem is. It's up north, and we probably ought to be physically closer to where the problem is going to be. If you ever have visited the Great Wall, you visited the Ming Great Wall. They rebuild the whole thing, and not only they rebuild it and connect places that never been connected, but they rebuild it. It's no longer round earth as had been the original. You take earth and just pound it and pound it and pound it until it's as far as you can get it. It's now brick. And those of you that have been out able to see the Great Wall, it's the Ming Great Wall. They thrive on exports. I mean, this is all the red here is specializing in porcelain exports. It's not just silk or porcelain. And the West just couldn't get enough of this Chinese stuff. And if you know what's the color, the famous color of Ming porcelain. I mean, Chinese do all sorts of colors, but Ming is the famous blue and white. Blue and white. and they say, you know, we didn't find this so attractive, but the West can't get enough of it, so just crank out the blue and white stuff and send it west. The most famous place of all is right here, and they just crank it up. I mean, it's not the Industrial Revolution quite yet, because there's no they're using coal. Well, it is industrial. I take it back. It is industrial revolution, but they don't go full bore with it with the railroads and the rest of the kind of stuff. So there's the famous tea horse trade. You give us horses, we give you tea. And they're exporting all over the place. Those of you that have been here for a long time have seen this diagram 1,000 times. Surely it is not perfect, but it's an attempt to say, and it's shown all the time. So there must be some credibility to it. It hasn't. You see it in the Wall Street Journal every now and then, and the Financial Times every now and then, or used to. A suggestion of if you take the total wealth of the world, who had it for the last 2,000 years. We're talking about a period right about here. You know, if this guy is even close to correct in his estimation, 70% of it is coming from India and China. With the ancient world of Egypt and so forth, about 10%, another 20% down here. And you can see it stays pretty substantial until pretty damn late. It's really, really kind of late when all that disappears. So what's that all about? To complete the story of the Mongols, you got to mention Tamerlane, who's just another son of a bitch. He's an awful thug. But he's got charisma, and he's got an overpopulated middle Central Asia behind him, and for his lifetime, it will create this enormous empire. It won't last too much further beyond him. If you go there, and Janet and I are still hoping maybe next year we'll be going there. We'll see statues of Tamerlane everywhere. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, who knows? But the heroes in Uzbekistan, in particular, he will bring all the plundered wealth, and there's an enormous amount of plundered wealth, just like the Mongols, that he will steal from India, the Caucasus, the Ottoman Empire. No, there's no Ottoman Empire yet. Well, there is. They just haven't conquered Constantinople. Bring it back to Constantinople, to Samarkand. So Samarkand is really a gorgeous place to visit now. If you go see all the stuff that the Soviets restored. They were in bad repair when the Soviets took over these places. And it's worth looking at this fairly famous mausoleum of Timur, because if you look closely enough and then look at the next picture, you say, yeah, they're not the same, but they're pretty damn similar. That's where the Taj Mahal came from. It's from the Mongols. Not the Mongols. It's some Central Asian mosques. This sort of bulbous dome. I mean, these pillars have no function whatsoever except decorative in either case. But so when the Mongol great grandson ends up in India, they'll bring a Mongol Central Asian sensibility of architecture and aesthetics with them. This was an interesting moment. I was unaware of this until reading this book, that there was a short period of time, not long, maybe about 40, 20 years here, where this thriving trade that had gone back and forth during the Pax Mongolia, it petered out during the Great Plague, during the Black Plague for a while, but rushed right back in. It did run into about 20 years of depression in this period of time. There just wasn't enough, there wasn't enough bullion, silver coins to go around. Where did it end up? End up in China, because Chinese had the stuff that people wanted to buy, and the Chinese hoarded it and didn't have a clever way of recycling the stuff that they had just they had just earned. What's the Chinese way of recycling all the stuff they earned from us? They buy our bonds. They buy our bonds. Most of you get it. Why do we sell bonds? To run our government, because we don't tax ourselves enough, so we have to borrow. And we borrow a whole shitload recently. By the way, the Chinese don't own most of the bonds, nor do the Japanese. Who does own most of the bonds that our government sells? Our own citizens, our own wealthy citizens. It's not that the Chinese own us, our wealthy citizens own us. Because it's the safest investment on planet Earth, or has been for several hundred years. Well, whether it will continue to be, civilization's history says it won't, and sometime at some stage we will default, and that'll be the end of that. But so far, so good. So far, so good. But to pay back our debts, everyone knows, not us, we're gonna die. What are our kids and our grandkids gonna have to do to pay back that debt? They're gonna have to do tax more heavily. It just has to be. And that's an inevitability. If they're lucky enough to have the money to pay off. In any case, this won't last long. But a barter system sort of returned in Europe because there wasn't enough money to go around. It was all in China. And that's a international system that is broke. There needs to be a mechanism to say you've earned all that money, just sitting on it is no goddamn good. It doesn't do you any good. You want to recycle it so people will have the money to buy the stuff that they bought from you last week. And John Maynard Keynes had a very fantastic idea after World War II for guaranteeing that the money was circulated in a good way. But the United States didn't accept his idea. We'll get back to that, but what we did. It's a good idea. We talked about that once, right? A very clever way to say, but never mind. It's you want to sit down for half an hour and talk about it. It's very clever. But now we're going the opposite direction. We're all sovereign countries. We do whatever we want, and no one tells us what to do. So the 1453, the Ottomans finally pull it off. They've been knocking on the door forever. By 450, there's almost nothing left of the Ottoman Empire. By 453, there's nothing left of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans have taken over what it was called Constantinople, soon to be Istanbul. I've mentioned this once before. When they take over Constantinople, at one stage it had 200,000 people. There's only 25,000 people left. It would go to hell in a handbasket. And it will be back to its glory days under the Ottomans fairly quickly. What's the reaction to the Ottomans taking over Constantinople and Rome? People are crying in the streets, they're beating their hearts, the world's going to come to the end. Up in the Orthodox Christian areas of Moscow, they've been talking about this for a while. They have always had it in mind that for where this came from, I have no idea. Frankopan doesn't tell us. It is part of the mythology of Christianity that in the 8th millennium, Christ didn't return. He didn't show up 3 days later after he was supposed to when he was crucified. He didn't show up a month later. He didn't show up 50 years later as he was promised. Now they've decided it's going to be the 8th millennium, the beginning of the 800 years after the creation of the earth. And their calculation is, well, Earth was created in 5,500. So take 5,500, and that was BCE. And now we go ahead. We add enough years together to get to 700, because 700 would be 7,000 would be the end of the 7th millennium, and 7,001 would be the beginning of the 8th millennium, and that's when the world is going to end. We're going to have the last judgment. And if you add, what number do you add to 5508 to get 7,000? You get 1492. September 1st, actually. And you know, if you're one of, when you didn't, whatever, it's still going on, I suppose. I mean, Putin talks to this guy rather regularly. I mean, we didn't encounter the actual human being, but we encountered the reputation of a similar character in Tbilisi, Georgia last year, who's just a retrograde jerk, homophobic, this and that and so forth. And this guy matches that description. And
Putin's Rasputin.
Putin's Rasputin. And then Putin's
America just put them on the list.
on the list.
The last couple of days.
Yeah, well, yeah. Maybe he's buying Bitcoin or something. Whenever you get this the fear that the world's going to come to the end, of course, it's yet another episode of anti-Semitism. 1492 is the end in Spain because Jews and Arabs will be thrown out of Spain. Where do they migrate according to? Well, this map gives you a better sense of where the migration occurs than Frankopan focuses on Constantinople. Well, that was correct. Not only voluntarily migrated, but encouraged, recruited to come to Constantinople. We need your skills. Come here and settle in peace. And yes, you're going to pay higher taxes. Jews and Christians pay higher taxes. But other than that, you have synagogues, work, you're well educated. Another place I recently became aware of was Fez. We will be in the city of Fez in Morocco, and I guess Jews were recruited there and treated rather well there for a long period of time.
And we were in the ghetto in Venice.
Yeah, in Venice, exactly. This is the red lines are all early migration. Now that wasn't so happy. The Venice, as several Shakespeare plays make clear. The black lines are later. You notice this line, right? We've talked about this someone before. Early on into what we call the Balkans, and later on recruited by the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. And so you've got a pretty reasonable explanation of how come there were so many Jews in Poland when Hitler decided to go do some bad stuff. So this is happening as bad things are maybe on the verge of happening in Europe. Maybe the end of the world is actually going to come. Columbus is going to depart. We talked about this before. Of course, he's going out for personal glory and find a way. But what's his main reason for trying to make money? What's his personal goal? What's driving him besides egotism and this and that so forth? He wants to crusade. He can't believe that the Europeans have given up on getting Jerusalem, and he wants to go find money and wealth to come back and conquer Jerusalem. And there's books written on this and so forth and off he goes. And so that era transfers into the road of gold. And I'll just bring up that same quote again. We didn't have a whole lot of negative reaction to it. We talked about this multiple times. I had not known that Adam Smith said this. I wish I'd have known that back when I was teaching history. And we got to the wealth of nations. Yeah, Adam Smith's wrong. This is not the two most important events in the world, but why from a Western point of view, is this a kind of legitimate whack at explaining capitalism, frankly? And he writes about, he goes on and on and on about this. This is going to provide the wealth. It's going to make the West the center of the planet for a little while. All this wealth that will come back, not just from the gold and silver mines of the New World, but from the trade that you get from India and China, which will take 200, 300 years to dominate. So gold. There were gold mines in Europe. There were gold mines here and there, but the biggest amount of gold that came from anywhere that came into Europe came from West Africa, and coming from West Africa. The actual country of Ghana is right here now. That would have been the ancient empire of Ghana. These are names that are familiar with us. Mali is a country these days. It's not there. Ghana is not a country right there, but more or less. I mean, that's why the Congo, that's a rather familiar name to us. These are all names of ancient African empires that were around for quite some time. Gold mines galore and transported across the Sahara for thousands of years, frankly. This is one of the most famous episodes in world history. This guy shows up throwing gold and created so much inflation in Cairo that it took him 12 years to recover from the inflation, perhaps. But there's gold there, and that gold is useful if you go get it. Timbuktu was not just a place for gold mining. It had mosques they had converted to Islam somewhere in the 1000s, I think. Scholars there, music. It was an area of learning. 1453, the Portuguese. This is pre-Columbus now, but the Portuguese on the coast, the Spaniards a little further in are say, it's going to be tougher now to trade with Constantinople, where the spices come in. One, Venice has got the trade locked up anyway, and two, now we got to deal with Muslims. Let's just see what happens if we send some people down the West Coast. It's scarier than hell. I mean, no one's ever been there. We have no evidence of people going down there. And early on, they bump into, didn't know it was there. Interesting enough, bump into all these islands. And the further they go, they find more islands. And what do they eventually do with these islands? These Portuguese and Spanish. Hold that thought for a minute. They will eventually round the arm here and get to what is still called the Gold Coast, because after all, that's where the gold mines were. And boy, once they get to the Gold Coast, it's more than just the islands. But make sense of that diagram. Sugar cultivation. Sugar cultivation. Anyone have a clue where sugar is indigenous to, where it originally came from? New Guinea, somewhere around New Guinea. 2,500 years it gets to India. Indians will cultivate it for quite some time. By the time the Muslim dynasty, the Muslims have created a Eurasian-wide trade network. They too are cultivating sugar. You can make a lot of money off of it, as anyone that goes down the cereal aisle would know. And who's going to now start cultivating sugar? Portuguese and Spanish on the islands. It's perfect. They're volcanic islands. They're very fertile. It's warm growing season. It's semi-tropical. And who's going to do the cultivating of that sugar? The slaves that you find when you're around the coast here. Because you not only bump into gold, which is a damn good thing. Good God, we can control the gold. We also, my God, we can control slaves. They build a fortress that you can visit if you ever visit Ghana. I guess the Obamas and other famous people do there, called Elmina, the Mines Castle. Well, it's a castle for a while, but soon becomes just a holding place for slaves. And many slaves. An everlasting memory of those that died across the sea. So the Portuguese are the first to round that coast. The Portuguese are going to be, it's a small little place, but they're going to have a lot of money. Gold, they're going to transport gold. They're going to steal the gold trade. It won't go across the Sahara too much anymore. It'll come back on Spanish ships. It will soon be transporting slaves first to the islands, and then once the Americans have discovered to the islands. And they keep going south. This guy is famous, Bartholomew Diaz. Why is he famous? What does he accomplish that no one else before him does? He rounds the Cape of Good Hope. He says, there's a bottom to it. You can get around it. It's a scary, scary voyage because of that that crappy boy that, talk about a shaky hand here. And, who did that? What's that red line? That's the equator. Why sailing below the equator was scarier than hell? Because you didn't know the stars. You couldn't see you didn't know, you couldn't see the North Star anymore. When you're on the equator, where's the North Star? Here. It's right on the horizon. You cross the equator and you can't see the North Star anymore. And if you can't see the North Star anymore, you don't know where the hell you are. Because Jordan, so you don't ever lose sight of land. They just creep. Now the negative of being close to land is surfs, all that kind of stuff. So you creep across, you creep down the coast, staying as close to land as you possibly can, because you don't know where you are. You'll eventually know where you are because you figure out the new star system. It's going to take a while, and they're figuring it out. The Portuguese are the first to figure that out. It's invaluable information. Oh, these new stars, these new stars, these new stars, these new stars. They eventually find the Southern Cross. Yeah, the Australians will put it on the flag. Why is this an unbelievably important piece of information to know that you can go down the African coast and go around it? You can get to India if you've got the guts to do it. You don't have to be as idiotic as Columbus and make a terrible mistake and get lucky. You can get to India that way. Of course, it's going to take until Vasco da Gama to do it. But this is good. So Columbus is off. Columbus has gotten lucky. He doesn't. His men don't starve. What he reports, there's all this gold. Here's the gold. They came out and the natives gave me all this gold. I didn't. Why didn't you bring it back to Spain? Well, what answer he gave to that, I don't know. On his third voyage, what does he find to make it a little bit more valuable? He finds pearls. There's something actually there. None of this. Columbus will die poor, but so what? None of that is what matters. What matters is the gold and the silver, and there's a lot of it. So there's a map of. Well, there's a map of gold and silver, or ports. Silver mines are in the triangles, gold mines in the diamonds. I mean, the most famous of the silver mines is Potosi right here. Jen and I visited this gold mining area just outside of Rio, which is stunning, stunning. There's a lot. What's this all about? Why do we got ports and what did the Spanish and what were the Spanish and well, the Spanish are going to own most of this because as we'll see, all the Portuguese get is this. The Spanish you can get most of it. So you got gold and silver mines over here. Well, that's a problem because Spain's on the other side of the goddamn peninsula. So how do you get that? How do you get where is it that you take the gold and silver to get across to get to Spain? You take it to Panama. Yeah, they didn't call it Panama. And you take it by mules across to the port of Portobello. And there's some other ships that are convoying. This is once a year. The ships come from Spain. They come during the season when the winds that blow you toward North America are strong. You're going to go back in October. You're going to get all these ships together. Veracruz, I mean, this is Acapulco. You got Veracruz, get space because Mexico is full of silver as well. Most of them will sort of convene. Should have put a red dot here. They'll sort of all gather together in Havana, surrounded by warships, and be convoyed back to Spain to change the world, or to change the European world at any rate, really to change the world. Just enormous amounts of wealth. What crowd will soon figure out that they can pick some of this off? Well, yeah, this kind of crowd, whatever. So there's other characters there. So the descriptions that the Frankopan allows us to read are kind of stunning. I mean, you get cargo. This is where you used to a storehouse where we used to have salt. Now you're throwing gold and silver in there. Enormous amounts of it. Of course, what's happening to the native people? Who's the one guy that stands up for this? This guy's famous as can be. Or Bartolomeo de las Casas. And he, to his credit, he will go back to Spain and go to the king and say, what we're doing is anything but Christian. Good Lord. We're destroying the native populations. They're dying in great numbers. He will have a debate with somebody else. The Spanish crown, to its credit, says, okay, we'll stop imprisoning them. They're going to die anyway of diseases. So, well, if you stop imprisoning them, who's going to do all the damn work? Everyone knows who's going to do all the work. It's going to be black slaves. But before we get there, the greatest Holocaust ever. Measles and smallpox, influenza problem, but overwork and starvation as well. I mean, the death toll was in one generation was rather stunning. Here's the Las Casas writing, they died from overwork, they died from diseases, they killed themselves, and they took pain, they stopped having children. I mean, these people said, it's not worth having, so we're not gonna raise our kids. We don't want kids to bring kids into the world like this. We're finished. And for almost all of them, they were. I mean, Cuba, the islands were devoid of natives within several generations. It happened again. It's happened many times, I suppose. This is actually fairly famous. Just before World War I, Germans are late getting colonies. They get a few colonies before World War I. One of them is Southwest Africa, and they are brutal. They're probably not quite, they don't quite come up to the total standard of the Belgians in the Belgian Congo, but pretty damn close. And this group in particular simply gives up, and they say, we're not having any more kids. We're going to die anyway. We certainly are not going to bring kids into the world. They essentially commit personal genocide in the world, and they die off. There's no more of them left. There were some for a while, but they're sort of gone. There's some pain that went along with making the West a rich place, and it's worth acknowledging that. Back to Europe. At this stage of the game, 15, 16, no one gives this guy any lip. He's luckier than him. Why is it that he inherits all of that? This one guy, all of this. He's Habsburg, of course, but there were several branches of the Habsburg family. There was this branch, and there was this branch, and even they sort of split up into difference. And by weird luck, marriages that didn't produce kids, betrothals that didn't work out, he ends up as the only male heir to the entire, to all of that. And he then uses the money as well to buy himself he becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. He just bribes people, vote for me. And he's got all this as well. Good Lord. No one gives this guy any lip. So in that period of time, everyone else, France, England, sort of backed off and said, just tread carefully. The good news for the Dutch up here, who had just left in this time period, had left Catholicism and converted to Protestantism, Calvinism, as a matter of fact, was that he was from there. He'd been raised there. And so instead of persecuting them, he said, well, I'll do right by. But his son was a little less wonderful. Meanwhile, I love this quote. Henry VIII, we know a lot about it, Henry VIII, and Elizabeth and the English are on the, they were this puny little godforsaken island, rainy and not a high population. Henry VIII, whose income was positively embarrassing compared to the church, that of the church in his own country. What's the significance of that quote?
Incentive.
Incentive for what? For the Reformation. It's not primarily about getting divorced. That mattered, but hell, he would have done it anyway. Primarily, he wanted to confiscate the church's wealth and have it his own, and he does. He's going to get he's going to get a divorce.
What's Frankopan's facts to support that?
Oh, this is standard. This is an everyday textbook. No. This is common history these days. So I don't know. I guess they all refer to whoever they refer to, but and he uses it quite wisely. Henry VIII says, "All right, now here's what I'm going to do. I've got we kings are always in danger of being bumped off by our royal rivals. So I'm going to create a new set of royalty." And I'm going to give them all this church land that I just confiscated. I'm going to keep a third of it for myself, of course, but the rest of it I'm going to divvy out by my Protestants. And by the way, they're Protestants. And then the average Lord who's got what's a Protestant? What's that? I have no idea what that means. Do I still do this? What do I do? Can I get to heaven still? This is all new stuff to them. And if you know the Anglican Church at all, the Church of England, it's pretty much Catholic. other than no Pope in most ways. So they never really go too far with their Protestantism. But in this era, in this moment, Henry VIII and his daughter are on fragile territory. They're surrounded by Spain's power. Already made this point, but there's a graphic to make it. I mean, you got slaves working the sugar plantations on the islands of the Canary Islands, the Azores Islands. So the plantation agriculture that's going to go to the New World has already been invented by Europeans before you even get to a New World. It's just a matter of finding the fact that the New World exists. And this will happen. The transport of slaves will begin. The Portuguese have got it first because they're the first to get down to where the slaves are. And the Asiento, the famous Asiento, the agreement of blacks, which will go from one group to another. Eventually, the Portuguese will have it. The Genovese have it for a while. The Dutch will steal it from the Portuguese. The British will steal it from the Dutch, and then Dutch will eventually. The British, did I say the Dutch will steal it from the Portuguese? The Dutch are terrible slavers. I mean, nasty. The first slave that arrived in America come on a Dutch ship. They come to Jamestown, and the year is
1690.
1619. Very good. See, you read
Brainwash.
the brainwash. Exactly. I mean, that New York Times project. What's that called now? What kind of history is that? It's the woke history. Yeah. What you mean? We're supposed to be embarrassed? Yep. You're supposed to be embarrassed. You probably worked your ass off hard, all that kind of stuff, but you didn't earn it all yourself. No, you didn't. It came. There are other reasons why you had that opportunity. In any case, why is the market for slaves in America almost insatiable? Because they don't last very long. 12.7, 12.5% diet en route. By the time you get to the Caribbean sugar plantations, the average survival for a slave that gets to the sugar plantations in the Caribbean is 7. There's plenty of them. Just work them to death, and there's new boats coming. And then there gets to be a second generation. I mean, to the somewhat legitimate credit of the English colonies, look at the tiny numbers in terms of the total number of slaves that came to the New World that ended up in English colonies, and yet there was an enormous slave population, because indeed they weren't worked totally to death by almost everybody. There was enough common sense to say, they reproduce, and we got 5 slaves. Tomorrow we'll have 20. That's our private property. But the mortality rate was kind of grotesque. In Brazil, it left, in 1872, when slavery is finally outlawed in Brazil, in 1872, the average life expectancy is 27 years. And there's stuff. I mean, I've doing slavery, and you find in news articles slave graves in the port region of Rio, and then this, and then even more recently. I mean, it's happening, but there's a whole segment of America that finds this unacceptable. And what's the excuse? Well, shouldn't blacks be thankful that they came over here? Look at the better life they got that they're living in Africa. And some of you, because just a couple of days ago, read this. Harvard's, it's happening. Where all this goes down the road, reparations, California's talking about what form it would be, how you do it. Would just be saying I'm sorry be enough? But it's why not? Why not? Okay, so money is being made like crazy. Society in Europe is changing. It will change slowly. It doesn't happen overnight. The middle class, it's true, a tiny merchant middle class is now starting to grow, particularly in the Protestant countries. Why particularly in the Protestant countries? Why particularly in the Protestant? Why not so much in the Catholic countries like Italy and Spain and Portugal?
They're busy with the 30 years.
I'm sorry?
The Catholics and Protestants are sort of busy with the 30 years.
Well, there's that. there's a 30 Years' War for sure. There's also at least in Spain and Portugal, if we're talking about those Catholic countries, Italy is now going to hell in a handbasket. So Italy is hardly a player in the world anymore. And Rome is depopulating, and all the monuments are falling apart and so forth. But Spain and Portugal, I mean, you don't have to work. you just you get part of the gold and silver coming through. I mean, there had been merchants, but pretty soon you can't buy even the wonderful Spanish leather and Spanish stuff that's created. Workmanship is good, but you can't buy it. It's too goddamn expensive because it's being bought by gold and silver that the wealthy in Spain have, and it's too luxurious. Whereas in Northern Europe, you've got a space that opens up. If you can come up with stuff to sell, the money is coming in coins in great numbers, but it does drift toward us because we got stuff to sell at a lower price than the Spanish, who are going to see their domestic industries go to hell in a handbasket. And once we get out of the business of merchants, we don't want to be merchants forever. We want to be bankers. Then we start lending money and this and that and so forth. In any case, if you're a respectable person, you start buying stuff to prove that you're respectable, like paintings of yourself. And the Renaissance artists are more than happy to pay for that. You get some really interesting paintings there. I mean, have anyone ever seen this one?
Yes.
Those that have seen it know. I mean, there's all these details, like the details that are just, they're so well painted of globes that sort of talk about the trade, and Africa's in there and details. This is, I did not know this until I looked it up. This is a hymn book of Luther's hymns. These are all Protestants, of course, because what's the Protestant message about salvation?
Works.
No good works. You can't. Good works is for Catholics. You can't bribe. You can't bribe. Yeah, you can't bribe God. God is all powerful. Good works are bullshit. I mean, do them, but God is not going to bribe you. You can only get there by faith. But God is kind, and God is just, and so God will give a signal that He has chosen you to be saved, and the signal is you have money. Yeah. And really early, quite early on, the Calvinists have equated wealth with salvation. The Puritans will carry it to New England and so forth and so forth. It's a very convenient point of view if you ascribe to that. But there is this other odd thing right here.
You have to approach from the left-hand side at a very steep
They say,
angle.
what the hell is that all about? And he never said anything. But it might have been an artist saying, you know, there's a lot of pain that's going into this wealth that these guys, I don't know. No one knows. It's all guesswork. But there it is. So next time you're in London, go to the gallery. So, another Frankopan quote of the time. A lot of swagger. You know, if we're wealthy, God must love us. It's surely a sign that He's on our side. He's good. All that fear that we had when the Ottomans took over Constantinople, that's in the rear view mirror. It wasn't in the rear view mirror for Italy, which is now in a bad place, but it's certainly in the rear view mirror for Northwest Europe, which is doing just fine. Of course, you talk about this problem of the Christian faith, God loves us. Well, which version of which version? This caused a bit of a problem. Still does. And then Frankopan makes this sort of bold statement. You said it wasn't a Renaissance. It wasn't a Renaissance. There was not a rebirth of Rome and Greece. This is not Greece and Rome. It wasn't even close to Greece and Rome. Greece and Rome had nothing to do with Northern Europe much anyway. I mean, they were there. So the arguments. But Greece and Rome, the philosophies of the golden mean, not too much pride, all that kind of stuff. That's not part of this. So why do we have so many? Well, what am I looking at here? What are we looking at here? This is John and Iko and I saw this actually in Vincenza, Italy, a Palladium architecture. This is the Italians saying, "Oh, we want to, you know, we're I guess we're like Romans, so we ought to make things that look like Rome." And who copies that very directly? Thomas Jefferson will copy that. It's not unconscious. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's got a picture of that when he devises, and our Capitol building also, all at Rome, and Frankopan said, no, if you want to get history right, it's not a rebirth. It's a new civilization. It's not Greece and Rome all over again. So the road of silver. He makes the point that this little window of time when there wasn't enough silver coins in Europe to buy stuff because they'd all ended up in China where the stuff was being bought. That gets solved even before he gets North American gold and silver, because the Portuguese will start transporting the gold back to Europe now that they've gotten to the Gold Coast, and there's new gold, there's new silver, rather famous silver mines in the Balkans and in Silesia, which is a sort of Poland, German. And new mining techniques. So there's more silver to go around and more coins. And so there's already a rebirth of trade anyway, before there even is a discovery of the Americas. There's the trade routes of the world just before things change utterly in the favor of the West. And there's out of a Western textbook, trade routes. It is odd, isn't it? Where's the Silk Road in there? What the hell? It is curious that they've even put that in there. Our Frankopan insisted, no, we got to keep putting the Silk Road trade. The Silk Road still mattered for quite some time. It wasn't just the oceanic trade routes that was going to make Europe wealthy for sure, but there was plenty to go around. The Silk Road still mattered for quite some time. So Vasco da Gama, this is, if you never read this stuff, his first, he was scared. Of course he was scared. He didn't know where it was going. He picks up some Arabs who know the oceanic routes. Remember, it's monsoon trade winds. There's a certain time of year when the trade winds blow toward Africa. There's a second time of year when they blow toward India. You just have to ride the trade winds back and forth. He gets an Arab to get into Calicut. He comes in, he wants to buy some stuff. He knows he can get rich if he can just buy the stuff. But as Frankopan describes rather nicely, it's in doubt right up to the very end whether he's going to be allowed to buy anything, and all he's sort of begging, maybe. Not on his second trip. He comes back on his second trip. He comes back with guns. He comes back with cannons. And he is to some degree being sent back to inflict pain on the Indian port kings that had killed some of his Portuguese countrymen in an earlier voyage between Vasco da Gama's first and second voyage. But this time he will defeat the king down here in Cochin. He'll imprison him. They take prisoners. The ability of Western guns to get trade, to get the best trade deals you want, is starting to happen relatively quickly. The problem is, I'm saying European, but there's all these European countries competing against one another. Portugal is going to compete against Spain, is going to compete against the French, is going to compete with the Dutch, is going to compete against Britain. So there's still competition, but it's competition more or less between the Europeans. Who do these Portuguese and the Spanish go to? Portugal is still a separate country at this stage, that's all kind of interesting. They will merge together under Philip II about 1560, and then they'll split apart down the road a piece. But this stage, they're still separate countries. They say, we got this competition. We really ought to just divide it up. They go to the Pope. The Pope's got lots of status. And the Pope sort of debates and draws this line right down here, 1494, and says, okay, everything on the west of that is Spanish, everything on the east of that is Portugal. It's very clever how that line is drawn, because it does give Portugal Brazil. This line, way over, that's not the Pope. That's 100 years later. Well, 150 years later, when the Portuguese and Spanish themselves are dividing up the East. But the world is divided up between these two, who, had they played their cards somewhat better, who knows? Who knows? Although Spain's one of the favorite teams for the World Cup this year, so maybe both will. What's happening to Venice now? They're sunk. The trade is going around the Cape of Good Hope. The trade, the Silk Road trade coming from Constantinople is drying up fast. That's not Constantinople anymore, it's Istanbul. The Venetians are in competition with the Portuguese. They can't possibly beat them. The Portuguese have got these ocean-going vessels, and the Spanish, the Viennese don't have anything like that. Who are the Venetians going to go to try and seek allies against Portugal? Muslims. But this is not so. If you're going along with this whole thing, you say this is not a shocking development whatsoever. But the whole notion of a Christian Europe and all that kind of stuff. No, you go to Egypt, and Egypt is still being run by the Mamelukes. Remember, the Mamelukes are quite famous. What were the Mamelukes incredibly famous for having done? Stopped the Mongols. These were the Mamelukes that stopped the Mongols before Cairo, and they are still running Egypt, but they will lose. The Portuguese and the Portuguese will defeat the Mamelukes in the battle in the Indian Ocean, and so Egypt is now going to go downhill relatively fast too. No problem. The Ottomans take over. The Ottomans are now going to pull up the side of Islam to some degree. The Ottomans are powerful now. There's a period of time here from 1453 for 200 years, the usual 200 to 250 years, some sort of time span, and then it starts to fall apart on them, where they're really quite dramatic. They will fight the Portuguese. They'll win battles against the Portuguese. The Ottomans will give the Portuguese and anyone else a good run for their money in this overseas trade for quite some time. It's not as if Europe is now in total charge of the world quite yet. It's going to happen later. So I like the fact that he tries hard in this chapter to make the point that this is a golden age, not just for Spain and Portugal and the Dutch and later the British, but for all of these of Central Asia and Europe as well. These societies all thrive during this time because of the trades. And so it's not, the gold and the silver may be coming from the New World, but it's getting spread around Asia as well, because they got most of the stuff that the Europeans want to buy, or at least a hell of a lot. And furthermore, there is no Europe. There is competitors in Europe who will strike deals up against one another, allies with Muslims and Ottomans and whoever's available. He talks about these three gunpowder empires. They're gunpowder empires because these are the three empires that were early enough or wise enough early enough to adapt cannons and rifles and defeat their foes and run about 250 years, maybe 300 years of thriving empires. The Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughal Empire. They will all go down the tubes down the road. Where's the money coming from? Well, to say again, gold and silver mines, but this one, if you were, I think some of you, Janet and I were there. I went inside that mine with the scary hill. It's unbelievable. For more than 100 years, half of the gold, half of the silver that was mined in the world came from that single mine for more than 100 years. And of course, it wasn't mined by Spaniards. There were no Indians to mine because they'd already died or run away to the hills because they knew they did. Estimates range from as high as 8 million to as low as 2 million of deaths of black slaves that produced that wealth that would have come back to Europe to stimulate capitalism, to allow the growth of cities, banks, yada, 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 yada. A price was paid by another set of people for what the good stuff that's going to happen. And that's all he's saying. But to repeat again, for at least until 1750, somewhere around there, it's not just Europe, North Europe that's doing well. So is the Ottoman Empire, and so is Safavid dynasty, and so are the Mughals, and so is Ming, and then Qing China. There's enough, or there's distribution enough, and there's enough competition. So artistically, I mean, there's various architectural wonders you can point at to sort of point that out. Probably the most famous of the Ottoman mosque, which is not in Istanbul, but in Edirne, which is in European part of Islam. Isfahan, some of you, I know John Ico been there. Anybody else lucky enough to ever been to Isfahan? Jan was in Isfahan. I got to go there briefly. The Taj Mahal, the Mughal dynasty. This is when it's with this wealth that the Ming dynasty is going to build the Forbidden City, which is more than just this one building. Those of you who've been going to this, and then there's another, and then there's another, and there's about 50 of these damn things. It's unbelievable. And in this time period, where I've crudely tried to splice out, there is not that much wealth redistribution. I mean, there's some, but if this diagram is even close to approximating where the wealth in the world was distributed between 1550 and 1750, there really isn't that much great change in the distribution. Well, if you can see down the road, it's going to be quite dramatic relatively soon. But the point being made by Frankopan is, for a while, everyone was in the game. If you had an empire, he makes the point that both the Ottoman and the Safavid dynasties did well. They had things to sell, like Ottoman rugs and Persian rugs, but that wasn't where they made the most money. They made the most money from transport back and forth. The Ottoman Empire was dynamic, and it gave Europe quite the scare. I mean, at 1453, it's Constantinople. By 1517, I think they've got Cairo. They've attacked Portuguese ports in India in the 1520s. By 1540, they've taken Hungary. For the next 150 years, they almost get Vienna. 1683 is kind of the high point, but that's 200 years of dynamism, where they're giving Europe more than a run for its money, well run, tolerant, this and that and so forth. And then it starts to fall apart. Religiously conservative. The army, which is supposed to be a bunch of a slave army, which doesn't have children, becomes very corrupt and sort of runs the show and kills sultans. The same will happen in the Safavid Empire. This is when Persia, Iran becomes Shiite. It's now. This is a dynasty, the family that early on is able to adapt to rifles and gunpowder cannons and so forth, and defeat their and turn Persia back into Persia, Iran, whatever you want to call it, into a real empire, going with the ancestry going back 250 years, with pride, well run for a while. Isfahan, we've already mentioned, but they will run. They've got problems because it's squeezed in between the Ottomans and the Mughals, who are more powerful than them. But the two empires that make the loads of money are the Mughal Empire, Mongol, and China, which is Ming Dynasty for a while. Then the Ming Dynasty falls apart, but it's taken over by the Qing Empire, who does quite a good job themselves. They're going to get the lion's share of the wealth that flows from Europe east. Not surprisingly, I mean, I was curious about this. I looked it up. In 1600, India and China had close to 50% of the world's population. Of course, they're going to produce stuff. They got so many people to work. They've got entrepreneurs. They've got a domestic economy itself, which is producing stuff for domestic consumption. These days, if you took the population in India and China, it's nowhere near 50. It's only 36%. That's only a third of the world. They had the most stuff to sell. If you had never heard this story, this is such an interesting story about India. Sometimes devote 2 days to do Indian history. Babur, we know about Babur. He wasn't an elephant. He's the great grandson of Timur, and Timur lived in Central Asia. He doesn't succeed. He tries to establish an empire around Samarkand. He's defeated. He runs off to to Kabul, where it's successful, but only with South help. He keeps going because the real money, the real, everyone knows the real wealth is in India. And he arrives at an opportune time where the Delhi Sultanate, 1526. I mean, the Delhi Sultanate has been established about 1204. So the typical 200 and 250 year period of before things go to hell in a handbasket. The Delhi Sultanate has become quite corrupt and has fallen apart. It doesn't rule India at all anymore. It's rather easy to overthrow. And the Mughal dynasty is established. And they will be in power right up until, frankly, until the Indians, the British take over in 1853, 1856, 1857, somewhere around there. And the greatest of all of them, on everybody's list of among the 5 greatest Indian leaders ever, there was Ashoka way back that adopts the Buddhism. Akbar is top 2 or 3. He's incredible. He's tolerant. He works hard to find a balance, tolerance between Indian Muslims and Hindus. He even invents a new religion, which sort of melds the ideals of the two, but it doesn't take. He gives Zoroastrians and Christians freedom of worship. He works hard to give the poor a better work. He really works hard to upgrade the standard, the status of women, almost getting rid of the practice of sati. What's sati? Your husband dies and you throw yourself on his funeral pyre, his funeral pyre. I mean, my God, which was not a Muslim thing. This was a Hindu thing. Many of the great buildings that one would visit start during this period, Fatehpur Sikri, this and that and so forth. He subsidizes this. And it's an enormous period of growth for India. And if those of you who traveled India know there's monuments all over the place, most of them, or at least an awful lot of them, at least up north, northwest, are Mongol monuments. Fatehpur Sikri, this city that's going to be his capital, but it's abandoned early on. It's unbelievable out in the desert somewhere. It will fall apart when this idiot, Ramsay Thomas, who turns the tolerance of his grandfather upside down and demands conversion to Islam, takes his empire deep into the Hindu South and runs into rebellion. And by the time the Dutch show up and the British show up, the Mongol Empire is pretty much in name only. It's just local leaders, local Maharajas who are running the show. And the British and the Dutch are going to have no trouble playing them off one against one another once they get to power. In Ming China, I've mentioned this already, the Ming dynasty is brilliant for quite some time until it runs into the future stuff. They do what every new dynasty does. Everyone, it's a formula. You redistribute land. It's the first thing you do. The peasants have gotten the land stolen from them by corrupt Confucian bureaucrats. You take the land, you take the land away from the corrupt bureaucrats, redistribute the land, you lower the tax burdens, you bring back a new Confucian bureaucracy, and you try and make it as honest and moral, upstanding, and not self-serving as possible. It works for 2 or 3 generations, maybe 4 or 5. They move the capital to Beijing, which is odd because it's a crappy city. There's so much nicer cities down south. They rebuild the Great Wall, reconnect the Grand Canal. They send Zheng Ho on 7 voyages with these huge ships. Eventually he comes back, and for whatever reason, probably because they're more worried about tribes to the north than anything else. And furthermore, Zheng Ho doesn't come back with anything that's really, to the Chinese taste, much worth having. They got some giraffes, that's interesting. And, porcelain factories go crazy. They rebuild the Great Wall. By now, the Spanish have said, well, we're not just going to take the silver across the Panama and then on to Spain. Yeah, we'll just come across the Pacific. And we gotta stop. It's a long trip. So all the way from Mexico across the Pacific, we'll stop for a convenient place. Well, here's we'll call this place the Philippines for King Philip. They're ours. And there's this little town called Manila, which pretty soon booms because There's lots of silver that's going to soar up there. Where's the silver going to end up? It's going to end up in China. And this, so the Chinese are rich because they got all this to sell. Porcelain, silk, tea. I mean, there's about 18 different things listed here that they're selling. They're not buying that much outside. I mean, the porcelain alone is a fascinating story. I mentioned before this famous. You can go visit this place. It's out in the countryside actually, but there's like 50,000 workers in factories producing stuff for all over the planet, and they adapted. Said, what are the Dutch like? What are the British like? What are the Americans like? We'll make stuff that they like. Eventually, the Dutch sort of get close. The famous Delft, but of course it's really nice. Delft is right there near The Hague. Why are the Spanish? Why are the Chinese able to attract so much stuff? Well, they one, because they supply so much of the stuff that people want to buy, and two, for whatever reason, they value silver more than gold, and so you can get more for your silver by buying Chinese stuff. I mean, here are coins minted in potency that are going to end up in China, whether it's silks or whatever. About 1750, it does start to fall apart. Silver is one of the causes. Just like silver is a cause of problems in Spain and Portugal. You got so much silver in the hands of not everybody that prices get high. The increasingly corrupt government, Ming in this case, no, it's Qing in this case, says, you know, you peasants, you pay your taxes in silver. Peasants, we can't come up with that kind of silver. So you get the peasant rebellions. Things are going to, by 1750, the Chinese genius is falling apart. Even so, as late as 1783, when the rather famous British envoy from George Macartney sent to make a trade deal with China, comes to see the emperor. The emperor says, you know, you can buy as much of the stuff of ours as you want, but there's nothing much of yours that we want. So feel free to buy. We'll tell you when you can come to Hong Kong, only that, Guangzhou, Hangzhou. You can be there for 2 months, then you got to leave. You apply, you adhere to our rules. But we're right on the cusp of the Opium Wars. Where's the opium coming from that the Chinese are going to smoke? From India. And the Indians didn't cultivate a lot of opium, but the British did, because it's so incredibly valuable to sell in China. China is now running into problems socioeconomically. There are miserable people. So opium sales are going to soar. The Chinese beg, say, you don't understand what you're doing. You know what you're doing. You're killing people. And Queen Victoria never answers. And that is 1850. And it's just about then that the redistribution of wealth toward Europe just goes bizarre, goes off the handrails. The Opium Wars, 1839, 1860, and it's in 1857 that the British in the East Indian Company is told by the government, we're taking it over. It's no longer yours to run, it's ours. What had happened that they had to do it? The Indians had almost taken it back. There had been a rebellion. There was no, the East Indian, what's the analogy? There must be analogies all over the place. It's a corporate structure, but really it's a state in itself. The British East Indian Company, like the Dutch East Indian Company, was on paper just a corporation, but it really was its own country. It had its own army. Its army were called the Sepoys, and the Sepoys were Indians who served in the army, and they were paid relatively well. What was the reason? And there was conflict between Muslims and Hindus in the army. There was anger at being mistreated, and then came the ultimate. New cartridges came to India from Britain, and the cartridges of gunpowder, Cartridges have to be sealed with something. And they were sealed with animal fat, pork fat. Pork fat. And when-
That was the reason for the mutiny, but I never got the notion that that was really a true
Yeah,
story.
no, it's true.
It was just a myth.
It's true, it's true. That's not the main reason. That's not the main reason. You're right. The main reason was that the Indians have about had it now. The sepoys come very close to taking India back. And so the British government has to send in troops and save the day, just as will have to happen in the rebellion in China, the Boxer Rebellion in China, 40 years later. And the Indian government said, well, we're here now. So since we're here now, we're just going to take over the country. We're going to run it as part of our empire. And at that moment, it's not just because of those two incidents, but it's symbolic and close enough. And the Industrial Revolution is taking off. Once the British government goes into India, what happens to all British textiles? I mean, all Indian-made textiles, which the world had bought in gobs of huge. I mean, they're cotton, they're well made, they're dyed nice colors. What happens to the British textile, the Indian textile industry? The British government says, you'll make no more textiles. You'll send us your cotton. We'll make the textiles in our factory, and we'll send the textiles back to you, and you will buy the textiles. That's the deal. And that was the deal.
One thing that Frankopan didn't bring up, around 1700, the Europeans cracked the code for hard-case porcelain.
Yeah. I think it was the French early. Yeah, no.
No, it started in Mysore,
Uh,
and then it soon spread.
Yeah, once it's out of that. Yeah, once it's out of that.
It spread rapidly. once it
Yeah,
spread.
it took them a while, but you eventually you get it. They got it. So back to the last chapter. How's well, you read it. To repeat, in this area of time, the power was all in Spain and Portugal to some degree. England and France and the Netherlands were the future, but they were nothing special at this stage of the game. Henry VIII had to be very careful not to insult anybody in Spain. After all of this, Spanish had the army. Elizabeth was, who's going to rule for a long, long time, was quite clever. She knew very well that this whole conversion to Protestantism, which was nothing more than the Catholic Church, but without the Pope. Same, almost the same ceremonies, almost the same dresses, almost the same clothing. She knew that most people really were just as happy being Catholic. And she says, look, don't ask, don't tell. You want to be Catholic, fine. Just don't bring it up. You're free to, don't make a big deal. Fake being Protestant, and that's a fairly good policy for a while. It got nastier later, of course, because this wars of religion didn't come along. She's going to be attacked by the Pope. She's going to be attacked by Spain. How come the British are going to do so well? Well, the story, according to the man who lives in the country, is, I'm sure it's accurate, is that she hires this guy, Matthew Baker, who studies shipbuilding. He writes manuals. He says, he does his measurements. He says, this would be a better ship. You can get more stuff in it. It's more mobile. It's not going to be the same. It's not going to be anywhere near as mobile as these Dutch ships, but it's certainly bigger, and it's going to be able to carry more armaments down the road. Everyone knows the Spanish Armada. Philip II is going to punish Elizabeth for helping the Dutch, who he's trying to punish because they become Protestant and they won't pay their taxes. And the Spanish Armada is devastated primarily by lousy winds, but also by more effective British battleships. I mean, the whole part of Spanish Armada has to, the only way it has to get back to Spain is to go up and spot Scotland and come back down. There's another famous moment where a Portuguese ship loaded with stuff is stolen. I mean, the British are starting to establish their dominance of the sea. They won't be there yet because the Dutch are going to precede them for a while. He makes a big point about this. Why are the English more than happy to reach out to the Muslim world against Catholic Europe? Because the Muslims have got a problem with Catholic Europe too. There's a tradition here where they capture ships with Muslim slave galleys and they free them. They seek positive relationship with the Ottoman Turks. The Battle of Lepanto is famous, where a large the Holy Roman Empire is funded by Charles II, who's got money galore, but he's wasting it. Is going to defeat the Turks in the Battle of Lepanto. The Turks will continue on just fine anyway. But the British, they usually. And then there's the positive portrayal of Muslim characters in Shakespeare's plays. This point ever pointed out when you ever did Shakespeare? I mean, Othello is a very well-liked character. He's done in by some crappy stuff by a bunch of sniveling. Iago and a bunch of lousy people who are whispering that his wife is cheating on him and this and that. But he's painted rather sympathetically, as are others. In any case, it's Protestants versus Catholics and this and that and so forth. And Elizabeth is finally going to pull the plug. She says, "Okay, we probably got no choice. If we may as well fight the Spanish in the Netherlands as fight them on our own soil, so we will send troops there and help out." She kind of saved the day. It's not likely that the Dutch would have earned their independence without her help and her. The Dutch are tough. They're tough. I mean, half the country is under sea level, and one of their strategies, as the Spanish troops come marching along below sea level, is in heavy armor, is to breach the dikes, and all these guys just drown. But you do have this problem after that. You gotta, but whatever. Frankopan is anxious to make the point that the early British companies don't do well. They are not very successful, and he lists a whole bunch of them. And stupidly, why I even bother doing this, I don't know. But, all these, Sir Walter Raleigh's company, you go into the New World. It's some of you were familiar with this. He's one of Elizabeth's favorites, and he's got 2 colonies on the Outer Banks of before Jamestown. Now, about 40 years, no, about 20 years before Jamestown, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and they just disappeared. I mean, the one colony comes back with the second colony. He said, "We're the first," and then they disappeared too. No one knows. All rather mysterious. There was a daughter born, Virginia Dare, the first Europe, whatever. So in this time period, from the 16th century dominance, Philip II. Any of you ever been to Escorial? It's worth visiting. It's just north of Madrid. It's not far, and there's other things to visit along the way. It's enormous. But it's not the kind of pleasure palace that Versailles is. Let's just have orgies and eat lots of stuff. It's more Christian. Philip II is a nut. He's a religious nut. He has his his giant bedroom is got a wall bordering where the monks pray, and he's got a little secret window that he can open when he goes to bed at night. When the monks are praying, he prays along with them. He's really quite. And too much money is spent on religious wars and stuff. They're in trouble by the 17th century. By 1620, the Dutch have taken over. Excessive debt, this and that, all sorts of problems, inflation, and a series of lousy kings. And there's this inbred stuff. The Habsburgs are way too inbred. And the Dutch have their golden age. How come it's them first? How come it's them first? They're merchants. They know what the hell's going on. The British aren't quite there yet with their merchant mentality. They're going to get there with John Locke, but the Dutch are Calvinists. Money equals wealth, and they're pretty tough. I mean, they fought off the Spanish. So they invent these 2 companies, the famous VOC. which we know as the Dutch East India Company. And so you got these ships that are going to go all over the planet, bringing back stuff. The Dutch will dominate trade for 50 or so years. And by dominating trade, they get colonies. They got colonies. The darker colonies, the dark green will be from the West Indies, the West India Company. The light green early on, the Dutch East India Company. The yellow is all that's left when it gets to the 19th century. I mean, who will take the Dutch? The Dutch start South Africa. They have a colony there. They don't want to do anything there. The only reason to have a colony there is so that their Dutch ships can stop and get fresh food and water on the way. But these guys are assholes. Excuse me, sorry. I mean, if you talk about who are the Laos, who are the racists in South Africa? It's the Dutch. It's not the English that came later. I mean, the clerk and all that crowd, they were the real jerks. And there's a guy, we've got one of them ourselves. His name is Elon something. Yeah, so the British will take all this. The British will steal it all away from them. But just to make the point, I wanted to say, you just notice the Dutch had taken all this. Who had that first? That's all Portuguese. Well, the Portuguese are going to hell in a handbasket. The Dutch have got it all. They're willing to fight for their own freedom. There's 17 provinces of the Habsburg Netherlands. The bottom 10 will eventually become Belgium. The northern 7 become the unite under the Union of Utrecht. They will become the Netherlands eventually. They establish their own trade routes. They have better ships. They're not good for. They have the best maps. They have manuals for foreign languages. They're fantastic. They do a fantastic job of doing all you do for trade, and they do state capitalism. It was just flat out, no question that it's state capitalism. That gets a bad name because we accuse China of doing that, but everyone does state capitalism, for God's sake. It's just to the degree that you do it, and the Dutch did it hook, line, and sinker. That is to say, yeah, it's a private company, but we encourage everyone every Dutch that's got some money, please buy stock in our company. And in return, everyone that's got stock will get some benefits for the trade that we're going to produce. They invent corporations to some degree. This is a what's the right term? Where you can only lose your money. Limited liability. They do limited liability right off the bat. If this company goes broke, you can't come and take your family and your horses. You only lose the value of your stock. They have their own army. They have their own language schools. They have their own everything. They're probably the biggest corporation that ever existed, and they're very successful. This is not the Dutch that we will sometimes think of these days as maybe tolerant and benevolent and kind of open-minded. These were nasty people, infamous for nastiness, and often Indonesia. I mean, when World War II is over, the Dutch marched right back in after the Japanese really said, "We're taking it over," and the brutality there was quite awful. But they will become independent. I mean, they are the most important slavers for about 500 years. The first, as I already mentioned, the first slaves that get to Jamestown come on a Dutch ship. It's not pleasant stuff. They're quite unpleasant, uncivilized, but they're wealthy. And so, what's the point of, we see those Vermeer pictures and they're sweet. I like it. So homey and bourgeois, and that is that's not to make fun of, but the wealth is not coming altogether from just Protestant hard work. There's other factors that contributed and probably are more important at the beginning, and the Dutch will do fine. I mean, even so to make the point, this was not in Frankopan's book. It'll be in the next couple of chapters. Once the English Civil War is over in 1651, the British will simply spend the next 130 years stealing the Dutch Empire. And you get 4 Angles, 4 Anglo-Dutch wars, where step by step, the British will simply steal the Dutch Empire. One of the places they steal, of course, is that Dutch Empire, New Amsterdam, New Amsterdam. But you know, you can still go to Harlem. Harlem, you can go to Brooklyn. Those are Dutch names. And there's a lot of Dutch names in the way. Of course there are. Wall Street, Wall was Dutch, whatever. So slowly, step by step, England will not only steal the empire. England will copy the Dutch agricultural innovations. They're way ahead of Britain in that. They'll copy the commercial banking system. They will hire a Dutch king, William I, who just happens to marry to Mary, who was the last Stuart king's sister. And then they become Great Britain. You know, when does Britain become Great Britain? Well, you know, conquer the Irish, the Welsh, and then by the time you got Scotland, and you say, you know what, you know, Scotland, you're part of us now. You're Great Britain. 1707. How many? This would be a good one. We'd all lose because we don't. A day will come when there's like the Scotland will go independent. And what's happening next week? Is it next week in the Northern? I think next week in Northern Ireland there's elections, and the favorite to win the elections are Sinn Féin. And if they win, there could well be well, it wouldn't be allowed. It wouldn't be allowed. The British Parliament's got to allow it. Just like the British Parliament's got to allow a referendum in Scotland. And but you can see the handwriting is on the wall. The Scotland and maybe not 30 years, but some way down the road, Ireland is reunited. Scotland is an independent country and part of Europe and so forth. That may happen fairly quickly.
But it's a known goal, right? It's Brexit, and there you go.
Yeah. I mean, there's still reasons why Scotland should stay part of Britain, but if Britain is going to continue to, well, whatever. So finishing it off with some of the end of chapter stuff that he says, just to see if we want to. He keeps pushing the envelope on his thesis. Yeah, okay. There's every reason in the world to be proud of the fact that the democracies of the West have guaranteed certain freedoms, apparently not abortion anymore, but rights and certain liberties, but not that liberty and so forth, whatever. That shouldn't be denied whatsoever. No one wants to deny that. The issue is, what's the cause and what's the effect? Was it because of that the West got wealthy, or was that after the fact? And certainly the majority opinion, surely among scholars, it's after the fact. Not to be denied as fantastic. This is, of course, the argument for why, the sooner the better that all the British, that all Chinese become middle class and wealthy, because then they'll demand rights and freedoms. Maybe, or maybe not. It's an open question these days, and we all know it's an open question. There was a lot of violence that went along with this. It is, after all, a barbarian. The barbarian part of European culture is perhaps paramount above Christianity. I Googled British, the Britannica. Say, you know, just give me a list of some of the wars in this time period. It's listing them, looking at some of them aren't in Europe. There's an awful lot of fighting among Europeans, not just Europeans with Incans and Europeans with Chinese. And the 19th century, which is often advertised as, well, there was a French Revolution, that was really nasty. And there was World War I, and that was really nasty. But in between, there really wasn't much war. What? God. The 19th century was full of war in Europe. And we haven't even gotten to the 20th century yet. We're in the 21st century. War after war after war. And the argument was again, well, see, all that competition is good. These countries compete against one another. Yeah, not good when you're dead. I think all of you are at least familiar with Jared Diamond's book. I assume some of you have read it. His argument's very blunt. The question was put to him as an anthropologist by a Ghanaian. How come you guys got all the cargo? Cargo being stuff, and we don't. He said, that's a hell of a good question, because my experience is you guys are every bit as bright as the kids I teach back at UCLA. In a lot of cases, brighter in terms of common sense. So it's not intelligence. What is it? And remember the rest of it, because the guns, germ, and steel is obvious. The Europeans and Asians had all the diseases that the Americans didn't have. We had guns, we had steel. Well, what's the rest of it? What about the germs? That's actually quite interesting in the pandemic. What about the germs, the germ pool in East and Eurasia and not in the Americas? So it's just, see, you got this East-West orientation of Eurasia. If you got the East-West, you get one, you're just luckier than hell in Eurasia, because you got an East-West orientation, and it's so much of it is grasslands. And so much of grasslands are, you know, cattle and horses and pigs and all that stuff. And you domesticate them, and you got all that stuff to eat and all this beast of burden. And I'm here in New Guinea, and you don't have any of that. All I got is cobber roots to eat. So there's no grasses whatsoever. So their diet was terrible anyway. And if you've got all those animals that you've domesticated, guess what you also get? You get their diseases. And if you get their diseases, of course, the first time you get their diseases, a whole hell of a lot of you die, like with COVID. But you know, the second time, and the third time, and the fourth time, and the fifth time, and so forth, you eventually develop at least some immunity, not total immunity, but some immunity to them. Isn't that just incredibly wealthy? He says, and look, north, south, you know, so all these animals migrate. North America, they don't migrate between North America and South. They can't. One, because you're moving from a temperate area to a hot area to a temperate area to a polar area, as opposed to the same latitude. And he puts together this list of domesticatable animals. I think there's 17 of them, you know, and 14 of them are in Eurasia. And then there's none in Africa at all, which is odd. He says, no, that's not odd at all. It makes perfect sense. You think that a zebra would be as domesticatable as a horse. But no way. There's lions there. And so, of course, if you're domesticated, if you're a hoofed animal, you're going to develop skittishness and fright and fear and run, and you will not be. There's just not as many lions up there in the steppes. There's some. Whatever. It's a fascinating thesis. Worth reading sometime. What else? Oh yeah, he makes a point. You know, so we talk about art and math and science and all that kind of stuff. Can we at least also at the same time we're talking about that, be honest about how much of that math and science was devoted to weapons in the 17th and 18th century in particular? I mean, just think about Rene Descartes and this fantastic thing called analytic geometry, where you merge geometry and algebra. You can define a line, a line on an x and y axis with an algebraic equation, and with that, you get the weight of your cannon. You have a sense of where the wall is out there, or where the troops is you want to kill out there, and you don't have to waste a lot of cannonballs. And, oh, that missed, oh, that missed, that missed. You just put that cannon up at the right angle and with the right amount of powder, and you can can strike gold or the next ship you want pretty quickly, pretty fast. That's not the only thing that math and science did, of course not, but it did a lot of that. Anyone forced to read this? Anyone forced to read this in college? John, were you not forced to read the Leviathan?
The short version.
The short version. Oh, yeah, the little yellow, what was called, yeah. The Cliff Notes.
Sure.
The Cliff Notes, yeah. Well, it worked. It worked, yeah. So, what was Hobbes' point of view? It's just that. The human beings are just violent. Hey, that's not quite the view you get all around. That's not the view of most of the world. Fair enough, it is true that in the next generation, you started getting a more, oh no, human beings have rights and all that kind of stuff. But in this period of early growth of Western power, violence was the means.
I still don't understand this focus on the West, and violence was the same everywhere. I mean,
Yeah,
Native Americans here killed each other and took slaves, and
exactly.
the Africans did it.
It's
So
not-
I don't understand this.
Part of the reason the Aztecs could fall to Cortez and his conquistadors, because the Aztecs dominated all the other
They had
tribes.
the other tribe.
And the other tribes
Well,
said,
the other
"Oh,
tribes-
we got somebody.
the other tribes hated the
these
Aztecs.
guys for us."
No, he's not. His point is not that the West is the only violent country in the world. I think he many times says. I think I even got a quote that I forgot to put in. That's stupid.
Look at that quote we just had up before this, the next slide, or no, the other one,
No, sorry.
or there, only a European author.
Yeah, I think that's off. That's too much. But maybe he hated reading this book. It was an undergrad. I don't know. I mean, Hobbes's point was, for human beings are nasty. The only way human beings will ever behave is if they're made to behave. The whole idea of rights is absurd. A generation later, Hobbes comes along. Now, Hobbes is writing during the English Civil War. Locke is writing during the Glorious Revolution, when the last Stuart king is fired and William and Mary are hired. So there's a transfer of power. So I'm with you on that. But he's not that he's saying other societies have been violent. He's saying the West too. And to say, well, American exceptionalism, come on, come on. I guess one could make an argument that it's an unusual circumstance where you have where you kill off all the natives, and so there's none of them left, or almost none of them left. You offer bounty on their heads in California to bring in scalps, and you get a nickel a scalp or whatever you get. And then you fill it up with many different ethnicities.
I think we have more efficient violence.
We have more efficient.
More effective violence.
More effective violence.
The weapons.
It's a matter of going back to the cause and effect. We'll have lecture after lecture and slide after slide and 4th of July speech after 4th of July speech, democracy and rights, and say, yeah, that's to be valued, but that's not why it happened. It happened because of Columbus and the Gamo and a lot of stolen wealth and a lot of wealth that people got to have that was there to borrow money from. I mean, you can't start a business in Nigeria. There's no money to borrow. And even if you do, you got to compete against the multinational corporation who can now compete you in this and that and so forth and so forth. So it's to go back and say, be a little bit more humble, please. And in doing so, please recognize that the Silk Roads was once, fairly impressive, and that's sort of coming back again. Not that the West is going to go to hell in a handbasket. China had its bad moments and is retired. The West can rescue itself. But the notion that we won the Cold War and now it's our turn to run the show, well, we're witnessing, aren't we? I mean, most of the world is not, they're not against us, but they're not with us. They're sort of, they're sort of they're waiting to see what's going on. Okay, so next time, what is next time? But next time is, I had a list of this. Next time is interesting. We get right up, we actually get up to World War I. Oh, that little modest, yeah, that's, yeah. God. Everyone mocks this now. Says, what a bunch of, this tiny little island, wet and rainy. Are you serious? We had that big empire. How in the world did that happen? So it's the empire, the crisis. This is interesting. If you haven't read this, I encourage you to at least consider reading that one chapter, The Road to Crisis, where Frankopan says, we'll make an argument that it wasn't the fear of Germany that caused World War I. It was the fear of Russia. It was the fear of Russia. And everyone was afraid of Russia. And that would seem to be a fairly reasonable chapter to read these days. And that's it. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're done. We're waiting for that. Yeah.
I just want to understand, you said empires last about 250 years. Is that?
Yeah, well, I didn't see. Well, you can make a long list of successful empires, and it seems